After less than a year and just 2,500 miles, I've sold my Suzuki GSX-S 1000 GT, and today I'm going to tell you why I've sold it, along with everything I didn't like about it. Now, because I'm going to focus on the things I didn't like, this video is going to feel quite negative, but I personally think there's real value in a critical video like this. When I'm buying a bike, I of course want to know all of the good stuff, but for me the videos I find most useful are long-term reviews that highlight the bike's flaws, and that talk about why a bike might not be a good fit for what I am looking for. And none of the issues I have with the bike were highlighted in the reviews I saw before I bought it. So for example, you won't simply hear me complaining about the brakes, tyres or rear shock, all of which were fine for me. I'll start with the two biggest issues that were ultimately the deal breakers for me before moving on to other issues that instead fall into the category of final straw. The first of which was the headlight, which I found so dim it was borderline dangerous. Action cameras just don't give you a true image of headlights at night, so you'll just have to take my word for it, but on the few occasions I did ride at night, I had to ride much more slowly than I usually would do at night because visibility was just so poor. The throw of the lights is far too short and it doesn't make up for that with particularly good spread or brightness. And it's not even much better even with full beams on, and all of that meant I found the lights ineffective both on motorways with overhead lighting and on dark country roads. Now, to be fair, the same is true of many bikes, but I found the lights particularly weak on the GT, which feels like a big oversight on a sports tourer. I did buy a set of auxiliary lights, but my Suzuki dealer said they tried and failed to fit them on other GTs, so they couldn't fit them on mine. I ended up buying these front fender mounts in the hope that I could make a go of it myself, but the stock auxiliary light cables were nowhere near long enough, and having lights so low down is far from ideal anyway, and ultimately I gave up when I decided to sell the bike. However, while the lights were annoying, the main reason I sold the GT was its lack of comfort. On my 1 hour test ride, it was totally fine and I had no complaints. And I read and watched many reviews that said it was a comfortable distance tourer, so feel free to take my experiences with a pinch of salt. But the crack started to show immediately on my first ride of more than 50 or 60 miles. After about an hour and a half, I started to get shoulder pain from the seating position. Now on paper, the seating position felt fine and is similar to that of a super naked, and I always find super nakeds pretty comfortable. But I just didn't get on with the GT's position long term, and the shoulder pain got so bad that I considered selling the bike after less than 1,000 miles. Instead of doing that though, I spent a bit of money trying to fix the issue, firstly by buying the VMT offset bar risers. Now they made a real difference and meant the bike was no longer unbearable, but even then anything over an hour and a half in the saddle, even with a fuel brake, was still too uncomfortable for me, given I wanted this bike to do distances. The stock seat is okay, but not especially comfortable, so I then shelled out another £400 on the comfort seat from the new GSX-S GX. And while that fits my bike perfectly, it didn't really improve things for me in terms of comfort. It's 20mm higher than the stock seat, but didn't feel any different in terms of rider triangle, and while the padding, to be fair, was a big improvement, at £400 it's really poor value for money, the same of which can be said of course for the Suzuki heated grips, which, while pretty good, are way too expensive at £420 in the UK. And for comparison purposes on that point, heated grips on a Ducati Street Fighter V4 will set you back £295, and even BMW's heated grips on the equivalent bike to this, the R1250 RS, are only £250. But going back to comfort, quite simply I found the GT far too uncomfortable for a sports tourer, and I didn't ever want to spend more than a couple of hours of it, which was particularly frustrating given I'd bought it off the back of many reviews that said you'd be happy on it all day, which is exactly what I wanted from the bike. Now those two issues, in particular the comfort, were the deal breakers, but I also found other issues that are worth mentioning. The first of which is the panniers, which is one of two areas I had issues with the build quality on this bike. The panniers themselves are a perfect compromise in terms of size, and what I mean by that is that I can fit a full face helmet in either case and they don't stick out too far so that they might inhibit filtering or lane splitting. But getting them on and off was a total nightmare. The left hand side bag was a bit stiff, but no more than I'd expect, but the right hand side bag was ridiculously stiff. You have to line it up perfectly, navigating various panels along the way, and when you get there the tolerances are so tight that you really need to put your back into it to get it off, and I often found the bike lifting up as I pulled the pannier. And that was the last thing I wanted at the end of a long ride, especially if it was raining, and I've seen other people on Facebook with the same complaint on the panniers, and unfortunately it didn't loosen up over time as you might expect. The other issue I had with build quality was the paintwork. It looks very good to the eye, but I started to notice wear on the left hand side of the fuel tank after about 2,000 miles. Now that is of course inevitable at some point if you don't buy tank protectors, but I mention it because it's the worst I've seen on any of the 9 bikes I've owned, and because it started to show so early on. I only ever wore riding jeans with the GT, and I had it ceramic coated on day 1, which is supposed to help protect against minor scratches, although it looks like ceramic coating isn't particularly good at that. But anyway, it was disappointing to see such significant signs of wear so early on, with only fairly gentle use. Although on the point of quality, I should say that for a budget bike, the build quality on the GT is actually generally really good, and the paintwork issue can be avoided of course with tank pads. Away from the touring side of the GT, while the sporting side is probably its strength, I still found it wanting in a couple of areas. It's an inline 4, so it is of course a bit peaky in terms of power, but the engine sounds like it's going to explode at anything over 9 or 10,000 RPM, which is where most of the power is, and that really put me off wanting to ride the bike hard. Now that's probably a personal preference thing, so it will suit people who like inline 4s, but won't suit people like me who prefer twins or triples. And while the GT really does handle well considering it weighs 230 kilos or 507 pounds, it is nowhere near as much fun as a Super Naked, which of course I would forgive if the GT was more comfortable, but in practice I just found that I didn't want to ride the bike for long distances and that I wasn't particularly excited about taking it out for a weekend blast. So instead of being the best of both worlds, I found it overcompromised in both of its aims. And the journeys I ended up using it for most were when I needed a bit of luggage and wanted to cover a 100-mile round trip fast with a long stop halfway. And that for me is what Super Nakeds are really good at, and I personally want more distance capability from anything that's less fun than a Super Naked. So ultimately the GSX-S GT is just not a good sports tourer in my personal opinion. Now fuel range is okay. I regularly got around 150 miles before the fuel light came on. Luggage was totally adequate, although there's no factory fit top box option, so you need to go aftermarket for that. And wind protection was just about good enough with the stock screen, and actually excellent with the huge touring screen that I had. And aside from that, the GT just wasn't comfortable enough for me personally, and my back and shoulders felt discomfort every time I rode it for more than an hour or so. Now despite my feelings, I'm not saying this is a bad bike, I just think it wasn't the right bike for what I wanted despite what the reviews I watched said. And even then, I'm not saying other people are wrong, and I've made this video simply to give a different perspective to help you with your buying decision. And finally, if you're wondering what bike I've gone for instead, my next upload will be unveiling my new bike and explaining why it's a much better fit for me than the GT was, so make sure you like and subscribe for that, and until next time, ride safe.